Tonight's a response to an arts funding environment on the brink. Federal and state support streams are potentially running dry, and inequities in the American philanthropy system persist. Tonight is a response to a precarious world. Tonight is about loving artists. Deana Haggag, Tricia Heuring, and Venessa Fuentes see creativity as a human imperative. Deana brings expertise in philanthropy and the perspective of a funder with national reach focused on supporting individual artists. Tricia's lens is curation and community organizing with a constant eye toward how artists and audiences commingle. Venessa is an artist with a history of advocating for artists across and within varying spaces.
Hi, my name is Deana Haggag. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I'll let my ladies introduce themselves. Can I call you my ladies? Is that okay?
I
really like that.
But yeah, I do too. I think you should introduce. Like, is there anything more you want to say?
I'll get into that in a second.
Okay,
yeah.
so you really okay.
Yeah.
Just a quick introduction.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Go.
I'm Tricia Heuring. I am the curator and co-director at Public Functionary, alternative space in Northeast Minneapolis. Yeah.
Shouts out. And I'm Venessa Fuentes. I am a Twin Cities-based poet and writer and essayist for all intents and purposes for tonight.
I want to assume that everybody in the room knows about the work of Venessa and Tricia, but if you don't, I think you definitely should, because I've had a very lovely afternoon getting to know them both. And I guess maybe to elaborate a little bit more on why I'm here. So I work for an organization called United States Artists. Just for my own research, how many people have heard of that? Raise your hands. Okay, keep your hands up. How many of you only heard about it because you came to this talk? There we go. All right. So yeah, no one knows who we are, including me. So I work for an organization, again, called United States Artists, which is a nonprofit that does $50,000 art fellowships nationally in every discipline. So we fund in the visual arts, music, dance, literature, theater, film, anything you can name, we've probably funded it. We have never funded a chef. Everybody asks about that, only because we haven't figured out how to judge that from our office. So USA is a nonprofit, and I like to clarify that because I think it's important to note that we raise most of the money that we redistribute. We're not sitting on some big endowment bank. So some of the structures that Courtney mentioned earlier about funding are things that we engage in not just as philanthropists, but as people who have to raise money from other philanthropists, which is pretty important. And some background really quickly about USA before we open up to a little bit of conversation. So United States Artists was founded in 2006. And the sort of genesis of that was that in the 90s, the NEA cut individual artist awards as a result of the culture wars. The Urban Institute at the time, which is based in DC, was really taken with what was happening to American artists throughout the 90s. And once the Clinton administration decided that they would not necessarily bring back that kind of funding, they conducted a study where they were trying to assess what were the top 5 to 10 things that were affecting American artists. And at the top of that list was a lack of unrestricted support. One of the statistics in that report, which caught the attention of our founders, was that 96% of Americans at the time, and people still claim that it holds fairly true, 96% of Americans appreciate art in their communities and in their lives, but only 27% of them appreciate artists. I'm really taken with this statistic. I'm taken with this idea that a person can appreciate art but not an artist, and I was hoping that we could start to talk about that on stage a little bit. So we had this conversation earlier, and it's fascinating to try to dig into why we think that is before we even start talking about why the infrastructure for artists is so poor and also still crumbling. So I'm wondering if, Venessa, can I start with you? Talking just a little bit about why you think Americans like art but not artists.
I think that's very, very true. There is definitely a disconnect. I feel like as someone who writes and has always really loved the written word and has felt very comfortable, that's my cozy house, I think there's something, I don't know, I'm definitely speaking from the point of view of a writer, right? But I think there's this perception that art, while people value it and want to engage with it, it's something that maybe happens over here, or it's something, or doesn't, to your point, like it just suddenly is like on a wall or on a shelf, or so there really isn't this kind of pause and recognition that people like me, I have a full-time job that I work 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, and then I gotta, on top of that, if I wanna become a working artist, because I'm not independently wealthy, I have to like carve time out to dig into that, and it's not always sustainable. It's not because I don't want to, it's a eternal kind of struggle to carve that time out and to claim that time on top of parenting, on top of wanting to see my family and friends and be engaged in community, but it's also really, really important to me. So I think it would be, I can't imagine, I'm trying to like put myself in a situation of like, what would it be like if society at large, if that gap shrunk?
Well, I'm thinking about Ananya. I can't stop thinking about this performance. I'm like riveted from it, so that's running through my body right now. But it's like you watch them on stage and thinking about the artist, and if we value the artist, and are we looking at them as these dancers, or are we looking at them as people, that are in our community? And I know some of them, and so I was detaching from them as Renee, who I know, and looking at her just as a dancer. And so there's this sort of mysticism of the artist, I think, that we then detach from them as just people in our community. And so I think that for the general public, they sort of forget that artists are just their community. And there's this disconnect between the artist as this like higher sort of force and what the artist is capable of, which is capable of making us feel and making us, they create magic in so many different ways, especially the more they put into their practice. When they create art, when they create photography, we can't understand it. We can't make sense of it. And so it's sort of like the tortured space of the artist then that sort of distances us as just regular people from who they are. So I really love this question of why do we value art but not the artist?
Yeah, I want to come back a little bit to the mysticism of like who an artist is in society, and also the like how do you quantify, right? Like how do you actually quantify what an artist does? And one thing that I come back to a lot is I think that what art does historically, or what art has done historically, in my opinion, is speak across class. We talked about that a little bit earlier, that art is maybe one of the only things that can get people of different classes to be on the same page, maybe, and I think it's why we've seen art as being this sort of revolutionary force throughout time. And I think something that's happened, at least in our contemporary culture, as a result of like centuries of doing this thing, and especially in this country, is that it becomes too often equated with wealth, or artists as people become sort of the products of patronage. And I think that becomes really isolating for most people, right? Like they can't connect to an artist because the assumption is that they're related somehow to money, which is very different than being able to buy a book or buy a ticket to a movie. One thing I've learned at USA is that, I come pretty squarely out of visual art culture, so I feel really familiar in the visual arts, and I understand that infrastructure very, very well, but USA funds in all these disciplines, so I've had to really catch up to like, what is architecture like? What about writing, literature, dance, design? And it's really, really prominent in the visual arts, more than any other industry I've seen, this kind of attachment to wealth and what contemporary visual arts culture has become in this country. And one thing that's been frustrating about our work at USA, the way that we find our artists is we ask hundreds of people all over the country to nominate an artist that they think deserves this monetary award. And we ask people in every discipline, and we have the most number of recommendations in visual art every time. No matter what architect we ask, what writer we ask, they always nominate a visual artist, or oftentimes they do, and I think it's because they hear the word artist, and the first thing that comes to mind is like a painter in their studio, and that they have no relationship to that painter in their studio, and they don't have a relationship to a multi-thousand or $100,000 painting, as opposed to maybe taking a step back and acknowledging the breadth of American artistic practice. So I think one thing we struggle with at work is like literally the word artist and the connotation it now denotes financially. And then to get back to this other point, most people just have no idea how long it takes to make anything. They have no idea what toll it takes on the body, on the intellect, on the spirit, on the mind. And I think this is another thing that we do in the United States, especially, sort of like, we only understand capitalism in this way.
I have a show opening on Friday with an artist, Bobby Rogers, and this morning we were talking about where we're pricing his art. And it's not so much a concern of making money off the show, because we have some funding behind it, it's covered, but it's more so he wants his audience to be able to acquire it. And so we're balancing the print cost of printing these photographs, and then how many the edition is going to be, and where is he in his career, how much is his work worth, which is just such a bizarre conversation, you know, to put value on that, and but you have to do it, you know, and so we just end up sort of working with what feels comfortable, and we consider the Minneapolis market and what people are able to pay. And it was interesting because we're pricing he has 10 large-scale prints that are going to be on the walls, and then he is specifically wanting to have each of those prints available at a 16 by 20 size, so much smaller. And the print shop weighed in on 16 by 20 as a size that people would acquire. And then the artist is talking about how this is a size that he feels comfortable with. So it's this collective process. And then the gallery is saying, we think that feels good. So it's not just this one person, this artist deciding, this is what my work is worth. It's sort of like we're thinking about the market, we're thinking about people, we're thinking about community. So all of these prints are going to be available, and then it's, well, how many in this edition? And it's really important for him that his community can purchase his work.
So I think that's one of the first ways that perhaps our government sort of weaponizes people against the arts, right? Which is to build a structure that's entirely reliant on capitalism, and in no way, shape, or form to include artists in that format or in that. I mean, money in this country, money is not scrutinized for anything as much as it is if it's given to an artist, right? From a government perspective, we spend money more easily on the military, on a million other things that should probably be more addressed. So I think that's one thing. I think that that's actually a tactic to keep artists out of those capitalist structures, and to only build two formats. One where it's only for the incredibly, incredibly wealthy, you know, or it's bartered. And I think that that's a way, again, to isolate an entire public from artists. So I want to move on a little bit from that. One thing we talked about earlier today is like, well, okay, so if the question now is to convince an American public that artists matter, and I've been thinking a lot about so many of the divisions in this country that are longstanding and have been here since its inception, but have maybe been incredibly animated in the past 2 years or so on the heels of this election. And I keep thinking like, man, what is the difference between myself and somebody who is not interested in the values that I have? And you know, for a long time we were hearing that perhaps folks that are voting for, I'm just gonna generalize here and say the things I don't believe in, but you know, the things I don't believe in, is that people are like uneducated, right? Like that it was an issue of curriculum and education and access. And we learned statistically that that was not necessarily true, right? That plenty of people voted for the things Deana does not believe in, who have plenty of education and access and resources. And I kept thinking, well, what's the difference? Like, how can you be so afraid? How can you be so angry, right? And one thing that I started kind of tracking in my mind is like, well, are you exposed to the arts and culture, right? Like, what has art really taught me? What feels like it prepares me for dealing with the world? And one of the assumptions I keep coming back to is that, oh, art has taught me not to be lied to. It's taught me not to be conned, right? It's trained me to know that I'm in a fictional space and to come out of it, and it's trained me to talk to people that are different than me, and to deal with the fact that, you know, that reality is very tenable, and that this is why perhaps so much of our fellow citizens who are unexposed to the arts or feel like it is not a part of their everyday, we're so easily lied to, right? And so I wonder if either of you have any thoughts about that, and it doesn't have to be about, that's my take, right? That like art can teach us not to get conned. And I believe this deeply. But I wonder if there's anything, if you agree with that, or if you think there are other things you can definitively say you have learned vis-a-vis this industry that you think actual exposure to would make like the world a better place. But I do believe that would make the world a better place.
I'll go. I definitely think artists, you know, the role that we play in a society and have played since the beginning and will play until the very end is to reflect what is happening. You know, art is not something that, you know, to kind of bring in a theme from earlier this evening, like it's not something that happens over there on a chaise lounge with bonbons or, you know, like it can, but I think the kind of art that we're talking about tonight is, you know, it's here to make sense of what sometimes cannot be digested or comprehended, or it's just sometimes it's too much. And I think, at least thinking about my own process and my own creativity, what I try to bring into my work is, I just see that there's a responsibility to be a mirror and to reflect what is happening in our culture, in our society. And I think we're lucky in this Twin Cities community that we have a very active and very vibrant, I mean, you saw it in Ananya. If you're here on any given night, you'll see it Friday night at Public Functionary. Like there's just such an incredible and diverse and an amazing, like I can't keep up with it. So, and I think that's good. And I think, I mean, just imagine what our lives would be like without any of that.
There are so many people that don't have access to art. And yeah, it correlates probably back to that. But do they want access? You know, what would they do with access? Are they going to feel comfortable in galleries, or are they going to go to the orchestra? I think it's these ideas of like, well, what is art and who cares about it? And if they had access, would they even want it? And then who decides, the gatekeepers and all of this. So I think it just comes down to like, what if everybody had access to art in the way that you want them to? What does that mean? And then how do we change all of these barriers that are keeping people from art, and why are people being kept from art?
Yeah, I think another way to also ask that question is like, what are the barriers that are keeping people's art from money, right? So saying, my mother hates the opera. Like I can afford to take her now and she's not gonna sit through it, but like, what she values in the world culturally is just not getting funded, right? Or doesn't have the level of access maybe to resources that the opera has, right? So I think another thing is like, this country has very definitively decided what art is, backed that pretty aggressively, and then sort of left out like an entire swath of culture that just doesn't get to compete at that level, right? And I can't imagine this doesn't happen here, right? That like you watch funding go to certain institutions and not certain cultural groups, and then it's like, this is the formula that we're in. And it's really interesting now to sit on the other side of that, like when I have my like philanthropist hat on, and like to watch. The thing that's actually been really, really, really beautiful is that there are so many people I've gotten to come up against who feel like they understand this and they want it to change. And the reluctance to get there is just that we, again, scrutinize how we spend money so much that like we just can't get to the step of saying, we know this is wrong, so let's just invest here. It's like the level of justification we need for that is so grand and so ridiculous. And it blows my mind because it feels like one of the reasons I love being in the arts is, and this is gonna sound super flippant, and I don't mean for it to sound this facetious, but like I get to go home and not feel like someone's life is on the line. Right, like I get to feel like I can take great risk in this sector and not feel beholden the way that I imagine medical professionals feel or engineering professionals feel. And it's always baffled me that philanthropy is so afraid to take a risk here, because it feels like the kind of risk that if it works, you're golden, baby, like you just did the thing. And if it doesn't work, we're okay. We can just keep moving, But they'll fund, you'll sit, I don't know, we'll sit and we'll fund medical tests and medical things that could actually harm people, like we don't even know, but we can't seem to get there with artists, and I don't know how to translate that. And I think one thing I've noticed is, to clarify, like I am not an artist at all. I've never been an artist. I don't make anything. Been an administrator like through and through. I literally don't make anything at all. Like I don't cook, my handwriting is bad. Like I'm not a creative person. But like I am the closest thing to an artist sometimes at these funding tables, and it's like, oh man, like, how do we connect the artist to the funder to get there? And how do we encourage people to take risks? And how do we remind them that like you can do wild things in the arts and be okay?
I would love to like hear you talk a little bit about, from a funder's perspective, especially at the level that you're giving funding and investing in individuals. Can you talk a little bit about like, here's $50,000 and then what else? Like, you're gonna take a tax hit. You're gonna, like, as the artist receiving that support, like, say,
the demystifying the money. So USA gives out a $50,000 unrestricted award. This is important because there's not a ton of unrestricted money for artists in this country. So it basically means that we can cut you a check and you never have to talk to us again. We don't ask for a report. You don't have to mandate it for a project. It's actually a thing that ends up affecting some of the applicants for our award is that they talk too much about the project they want to make, and it's not the thing we're funding. We're just funding you directly. And one thing that we've noticed, so USA probably now has a little under 500 fellows, probably invested $23 million into the sector over the past decade, and we recently conducted a study. The organization turned 10, so before I got there, they had conducted the study where they wanted to measure the impact. So we asked every living fellow what they spent their money on, challenges they faced. Overwhelmingly, artists still spend our award to make more art. The beautiful part of that is that that turns into a whole secondary economy where artists pay other artists to make their work possible. I'm sure you all understand those infrastructures. But the thing that was a little bit disheartening about that is that we're one of the few unrestricted awards in the country, and you're using it to make more art, and you're not actually using it to take care of yourself. Like erase your debt, invest in property, start a retirement fund. And these are conversations we've started having with our fellows and with our upcoming class about ways that they can just protect themselves with the money. We also learned that artists would take a significant tax hit that they weren't aware of, right? So they'd get this tax bill a year later, and our organization, we generally, as a society, do not do enough to prepare people with how to manage money. Also, we learned that most of the artists that receive our award are already in a pretty precarious income space, so to make $50,000 suddenly kicks you off your medical care. Your kid loses their scholarship to college, you know? So I think this has forced a lot of us in philanthropy specifically to deal with, like, how do you legislate against that, right? So, like, if we could actually get our shit together, we could maybe fix this thing in the future. Not now, you know, after this election, we were all like, let's talk in 4 years. You know, like, let's just see if that's possible then. But I think there is, it is due time for some tax reform around individual artist awards and the money that comes that way. But in the interim, there's also this space a little bit which is very dear to me, which is that the reason I took this job and the reason I'm very compelled by this organization is that it has, by far and large, the most diverse grantee cohort I've ever seen. I think they put a lot of pressure on themselves to fund nationally, so as a little bit by design, they ended up getting into communities that just weren't predominantly white, male, and over 50, right? And they weren't coastal all the time. And I think one thing that kind of breaks my heart in this conversation is essentially what USA has developed is a very diverse cohort of people whose communities historically have not engaged wealth, and now we're even hurting them more, right? So, like, what would it look like to actually arm some of our artists with the kind of financial wherewithal they need to then build wealth, which is the reason we keep this country is in this space all the time, which is that very few of our cultural communities have ever had the opportunity to build wealth in this way. So we are thinking a lot about money, and I think for me, frankly, it is far more exciting to think about that infrastructure space because I feel like that is the most radical change I think possibly we could make for artists, which is one of the reasons I wanted to get out of presenting and more into the, like, infrastructure space. Is that clarifying? Yeah. Is that good? Yeah.
I was excited to hear you talk some more.
Yeah, and
just
thing,
like how we can better support artists and think about the structures that are in place. And, like, it's like white supremacy, P.S. Like that's what it is.
A lot of it, everywhere, all the time. Yeah.
All the time.
There's this thing also I want to say, how many people are artists in the room? Will you raise your hands for me? All right, so just amount. Yeah, tell your stories about money, right? Because you're, like, so the way my organization works is, like, there's me and our really amazing staff, and then there's the board and funders and all the people we respond to. And there are so many statistics we could pour out, right, about, like, artists need this, artists need that, this has to happen, this has to happen. And they hear it, and they go, oh, yeah, we should really do something. But last year, there was this moment, right? So we assemble our grantees once a year. They don't have to come if they don't want to. Most do. It's very lovely. We bring them to Chicago. They all meet. And I guess there was a conversation that was overheard between two dancers. Last year was our 10th anniversary, so USA invited the 2016 grantee class and then went back and invited the 2006, the first class. So we had 100 more or less fellows in the room. And I guess there was a young dancer this year who won, and she was in conversation with another dancer who was a little bit older who had won 10 years ago. She was asking her, like, oh, what are you gonna do with this award? And the young dancer was like, I wanna make this thing. And she just, like, totally put her, like, mom face on and was like, you will absolutely not make art with this money. Like, do you know that one day you're gonna be 60, 70, 80? Do you have any savings? Are you in debt? You need to invest this. I made the mistake. And then she's also, this woman who's really lovely, then got, like, super low affect and is remarkable and went, I have won the USA, the Doors, it's like she starts listing every award she's won, and she's remarkable, and she's won over all these years. She was like, and I have, like, nothing financial, I'm still struggling, and I'm in my 70s, and I have nothing to show for it. And, like, one of our board members heard that story, like, just in passing, And it was infinitely more impactful than any of the statistics I could have possibly thrown at them. Like, they came to the next board meeting being like, what is this shit about artists not being protected financially? Like, how do we fix that? And it's like, are you kidding me? We've been talking, like, we just paid someone all this money to write this shit down, and you could, nothing. So I think the art stuff matters, right? I just got back from a trip where, in Appalachia, in Kentucky, where everyone was talking about, like, statistics of Appalachia, which are heartbreaking, and we're all sitting there, and we all look bored out of our minds. It's just a bunch of funders looking totally bored. But a poet got up there and talked about the experience of growing up in Appalachia, and everybody woke up. Instantly, people were like, what are we doing about Appalachia? And it was like, we've been here for 4 days. Nobody's been this excited about it. But a poet got up there and really illuminated for everybody the things artists are struggling with in that region. And everybody
That's the
perked
thing.
up.
That's like you value the art,
But not the artist.
but not the artist.
Yeah.
So.
But that's, I guess, a way of being like, tell people the struggle part. Right. You know, say it in a real way. It matters tremendously.